What if I told you that a carpenter from Nazareth discovered the most powerful psychological weapon in human history? A weapon so devastating that it could turn fishermen into leaders, tax collectors into martyrs, and entire crowds into believers with just words. For over 2,000 years, we've been told Jesus' power came from divine miracles. But what if the real miracle was something far more practical and replicable? What if Jesus had cracked a psychological code so advanced that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to understand it? Today, I'm going to reveal the 3 psychological techniques that gave Jesus unprecedented power over any crowd. These techniques are so effective that they still control billions of minds today. And by the end of this video, you'll never see persuasion the same way again. If you're building influence, leading teams, or trying to move people to action, the psychological methods Jesus used 2,000 years ago remain the most powerful tools ever discovered for commanding attention and complete loyalty. Here's what doesn't make sense about Jesus. In an age without microphones, social media, or any amplification technology, this man could hold the attention of crowds numbering in the thousands for hours at a time. We're talking about outdoor venues with zero acoustic design, people standing on hillsides, no seating arrangements, no entertainment, no refreshments, just one man talking. Today, with all our technological advantages, the average human attention span has dropped to 8 seconds. TikTok videos struggle to keep people engaged for 30 seconds. Professional speakers with state-of-the-art equipment lose audiences after 20 minutes. Yet Jesus could speak for 3 hours straight, and people would literally forget to eat. The religious explanation is simple: divine power. But that misses something crucial. If you read the gospel accounts carefully, you'll notice something strange. Jesus' longest recorded sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, uses specific patterns that repeat throughout all his teaching. These aren't random spiritual insights. They're calculated psychological techniques. Here's what's really mind-blowing. Modern attention research shows that sustained focus requires 3 specific neurological triggers: novelty, emotional arousal, and cognitive gap creation. Without these, the human brain literally shuts down and starts daydreaming. Yet somehow a first-century carpenter discovered and mastered all 3 techniques without any knowledge of neuroscience. But here's the part that should terrify anyone in power. Jesus used these techniques specifically to bypass traditional authority structures. He didn't appeal to religious credentials, political position, or social status. Instead, he spoke directly to the psychological needs that every human brain craves, regardless of background, education, or belief system. Think about this. Fishermen abandoned profitable businesses to follow him after hearing just one conversation. Tax collectors, who were essentially ancient mafia members with everything to lose, gave up their positions instantly. Even Roman centurions, trained in psychological resistance and loyalty to the empire, found themselves drawn to his message. Consider the sheer statistical impossibility of this. Ancient Palestine was occupied territory. People were suspicious of anyone claiming authority who wasn't backed by Roman power or Jewish religious establishment. Yet this unemployed carpenter convinced people to abandon their livelihoods based solely on words. No promises of wealth, political power, or military victory, just psychological techniques so powerful they overrode every survival instinct and social pressure. Archaeological evidence shows that Jesus' movement spread faster than any ideology in human history, without political backing, military force, or economic incentives. Within decades, his followers had established communities across the Roman Empire, often at the cost of their lives. This level of commitment and viral growth is unprecedented in human history. This wasn't random charisma. This was systematic psychological mastery. And the first technique he used was something neuroscientists now call cognitive gap engineering, the deliberate creation of mental tension that demands resolution. The first psychological weapon Jesus mastered was the strategic use of parables, but not for the reason you think. We've been taught that parables were simple stories to help uneducated people understand spiritual concepts. That's completely backwards. Parables were actually sophisticated cognitive traps designed to hijack the listener's decision-making process. Here's how it worked. Instead of making direct statements that people could immediately accept or reject, Jesus would tell stories that created what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. He'd present scenarios that didn't have obvious answers, forcing listeners to fill in the gaps with their own reasoning. Take the parable of the Good Samaritan. On the surface, it's about helping strangers, but psychologically, it's much more devious. Jesus presents three characters: a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. The first two are religious authorities who ignore the wounded man. The third is from a despised ethnic group who helps. Now here's the psychological trap. The listener expects the religious authorities to be the heroes of the story. When they're not, it creates cognitive dissonance. The brain demands resolution, so Jesus provides it through the Samaritan's actions. But here's the crucial part. The listener has to mentally participate in creating the resolution. They're not just receiving information, they're actively constructing the meaning. This technique is so powerful because it bypasses intellectual resistance. When someone makes a direct statement, your brain can reject it immediately. But when you participate in creating the conclusion yourself, your brain treats it as your own idea. Modern advertising psychology calls this cognitive ownership, and it's the most effective form of persuasion ever discovered. But Jesus took this even further. He would often end parables with questions. Which of these was a neighbor? What do you think? This forced the audience to verbally commit to the conclusion they had mentally constructed. Once someone speaks a conclusion out loud, their brain treats it as a personal conviction, not an external suggestion. The genius of this system is that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Intellectuals would find deeper philosophical meanings to analyze. Simple people would connect with the surface story, but everyone would experience the same psychological process. They'd feel like they discovered the truth themselves rather than being told what to think. Historical records show that after hearing Jesus' parables, people would discuss them for days, even weeks. They couldn't stop thinking about them. That's not accidental. That's precision psychological engineering designed to create obsessive mental engagement. And this was just his first technique. The second technique was even more sophisticated, and it involved weaponizing something every human craves: the feeling of being special. Think of Jesus' parable technique like a psychological mousetrap. Traditional teaching is like offering cheese directly to a mouse. The mouse can see exactly what you're trying to do and might be suspicious. But Jesus' method was like building an elaborate maze where the mouse believes it discovered the cheese on its own. The parable creates a mental puzzle that your brain can't help but solve. Once you solve it, you feel proud of your insight. But here's the trap. Jesus designed the puzzle so there was only one logical solution. You think you're being brilliant, but you're actually being guided to his predetermined conclusion. This is why parables are so memorable. When someone tells you a fact, it goes into your brain's external information file, which gets deleted quickly. But when you work to figure something out yourself, it goes into your personal discovery file, which becomes part of your identity. Modern neuroscience shows that self-discovered insights create the same brain chemistry as physical rewards. Literally. When you get a parable, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical you get from food, sex, or drugs. Jesus had accidentally discovered how to make listening to him biologically addictive. But the most dangerous part was the verbal commitment. Once someone answered his questions out loud, they became psychologically invested in defending that position. It's called the consistency principle. Humans will go to extreme lengths to remain consistent with statements they've made publicly, even if they later doubt those statements privately. If this is blowing your mind, stop and hit subscribe. What's coming next will shatter your worldview completely. Here's the second mystery that reveals Jesus' psychological sophistication. Despite teaching publicly and attracting massive crowds, Jesus consistently created the impression that his message was exclusive and limited. This makes no logical sense. If you're trying to spread a universal message to all humanity, why would you make it seem scarce and selective? The answer reveals one of the most manipulative psychological techniques ever deployed: artificial scarcity combined with paradoxical accessibility. Jesus would simultaneously tell people that his message was for everyone, while making them feel like they were part of a special, chosen group that truly understood it. Look at the historical evidence. Jesus would often speak to crowds of thousands using parables that seemed simple on the surface. But then he would pull his disciples aside and give them secret explanations of the deeper meanings. He created a two-tiered information system, public teaching and private revelation. This wasn't about protecting sacred knowledge from the unworthy. This was sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to create intense loyalty and commitment among his core followers. Modern marketing psychology calls this exclusive access conditioning, and it's the same technique used by luxury brands, exclusive clubs, and high-end consultants. But here's where Jesus' strategy becomes truly devious. He didn't just create artificial scarcity, he made people compete for access to the scarce resource. He would make statements like, "Many are called, but few are chosen," or "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." This language creates psychological competition among listeners. When people believe they're competing for limited access to something valuable, their desire for it increases exponentially. It's called the scarcity principle, and it triggers ancient survival instincts that bypass rational decision-making. Jesus was essentially hacking the human brain's resource competition programming. Even more sophisticated was how he handled direct requests for private teaching. He wouldn't automatically grant them. Instead, he would test people's commitment first. Remember the rich young ruler who wanted to follow him? Jesus gave him a costly requirement: sell everything and give to the poor. When the man couldn't meet this standard, Jesus let him walk away. This accomplished two psychological objectives simultaneously. First, it demonstrated that access to Jesus' inner circle required sacrifice, which increased its perceived value. Second, it created social proof for his existing followers. They had made sacrifices that others couldn't, which validated their special status. The psychological result was predictable. His core followers became fanatically loyal while maintaining the belief that they were part of an exclusive group with access to ultimate truth. The second psychological weapon Jesus mastered was the chosen group illusion, making every individual feel simultaneously special and part of something bigger than themselves. This technique exploits two fundamental human psychological needs: the need for individual significance and the need for tribal belonging. Here's how the system worked. Jesus would use inclusive language when addressing crowds. "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden." This made everyone feel personally invited. But then he would use exclusive language when explaining deeper concepts. "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom, but not to others." This created what psychologists call graduated initiation. People would start by feeling generally included, then gradually discover they could earn access to increasingly exclusive levels of understanding and community. Each level required greater commitment, but also provided greater psychological rewards. The genius of this system is that it exploited the human brain's status-seeking mechanisms. Humans are hardwired to pursue social status because it historically meant survival and reproductive success. Jesus created an artificial status hierarchy where spiritual insight and commitment determined your level, not wealth, education, or political position. But he added a crucial twist that made this system psychologically irresistible. He positioned himself as the ultimate insider with access to exclusive relationship with the divine, while simultaneously presenting himself as humble and accessible. This created a paradox that the human brain finds fascinating: ultimate power combined with approachable humanity. The historical records show this technique was devastatingly effective. People would abandon family relationships, career prospects, and social standing for the opportunity to be part of Jesus' inner circle. They weren't just following a teacher, they were competing for status within a group they perceived as divinely chosen. Jesus reinforced this psychology through symbolic actions. He would eat with his disciples, call them friends instead of servants, and promise them positions of authority in his future kingdom. These weren't just kind gestures. They were strategic status rewards that deepened psychological commitment. Even more sophisticated was how he handled conflict within the group. When disciples argued about who would be greatest in the kingdom, Jesus didn't shut down their status competition. Instead, he redefined the competition itself. Whoever wants to be first must be servant of all. This channeled their status-seeking drive toward behaviors that served his mission. The psychological result was a core group of followers who were simultaneously completely devoted to Jesus personally and completely committed to outperforming each other in demonstrating that devotion. They had been psychologically programmed to compete for his approval while believing their competition was actually spiritual growth. This created what modern psychology calls elevated group cohesion, a social dynamic where group members become more loyal to the group than to their own individual interests, because their individual status depends entirely on their standing within the group. Think of Jesus's chosen group strategy like an exclusive nightclub with a brilliant twist. Most exclusive venues create scarcity by simply keeping people out. But Jesus created a club where anyone could get in the front door, but only the truly committed could access the VIP sections. The front door was his public teaching. Anyone could listen to the parables and feel included. But the real value was in the back rooms where he gave private explanations, personal attention, and promises of future rewards. To access these areas, you had to prove your commitment through sacrifice, loyalty, and exclusive devotion. This system was psychologically addictive because it combined two powerful reward mechanisms. First, the escalating commitment principle. Each level of access required slightly more sacrifice, but provided proportionally greater rewards. Second, the social proof effect. Seeing others make those sacrifices validated your own decisions to invest more deeply. The most brilliant part was that people never felt manipulated because they always had a choice. Jesus would present the requirements clearly and let people decide. But the psychological pressure was enormous because walking away meant admitting you weren't special enough to make the cut. Modern research shows this technique creates what psychologists call sunk cost psychology. Once people invest significant time, energy, or resources into gaining access to a group, they become psychologically unable to walk away, even when the costs continue increasing. Their identity becomes tied to their membership status. Jesus had discovered that the most powerful way to control people isn't through force or authority. It's through making them compete for the privilege of being controlled. If you're still watching, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit like and subscribe now for all the secrets. Here's the third and most sophisticated mystery about Jesus's psychological power. He convinced people to love him more by promising he would die for them. This is completely backwards from normal human psychology. Usually, when leaders face death, their followers scatter to protect themselves. But Jesus managed to turn his impending execution into the ultimate proof of his power and love. This defies everything we know about leadership psychology. Strong leaders are supposed to project invincibility, not vulnerability. They're supposed to promise victory, not death. They're supposed to offer their followers safety and success, not suffering and persecution. Yet Jesus did the exact opposite and somehow made it more appealing than any worldly leader's promises. Even stranger, he positioned his death not as a failure or tragedy, but as a strategic victory that would actually increase his power and influence. He told his followers that his death would be better for them than his continued physical presence. He convinced them that watching him die would somehow benefit them more than having him alive to continue teaching and performing miracles. From a purely psychological perspective, this should have been impossible. Death represents the ultimate loss of power. Leaders who can't protect themselves certainly can't protect their followers. Movements typically collapse when their founder dies, especially if that death involves public humiliation and execution by the authorities they opposed. But Jesus somehow reframed his crucifixion as the ultimate demonstration of his commitment to his followers, rather than evidence of his defeat by his enemies. He convinced them that voluntary death for their benefit was actually a superior form of power compared to staying alive to help them directly. The historical evidence shows this reframing was devastatingly effective. Instead of scattering after his crucifixion, his followers became more committed than ever. Instead of seeing his death as proof that he wasn't divine, they saw it as proof that his love for them was divine. Instead of concluding that following him was dangerous, they concluded that his willingness to die for them made him worthy of their own willingness to die for him. This psychological reversal is so profound that it created a completely new category of leadership: sacrificial authority. Jesus established the principle that true power comes not from what you can take from people, but from what you're willing to give up for them. This was a revolutionary concept that transformed how humans think about leadership, authority, and power. But the most brilliant part was how he positioned this sacrifice as both completed and ongoing. He died once historically, but the psychological impact of that death would continue forever, creating permanent emotional debt in anyone who accepted his gift. The third psychological weapon Jesus mastered was the ultimate sacrifice paradox, using voluntary death as the final proof of superior power and unconditional love. This technique exploits the deepest psychological mechanisms in the human brain: reciprocity, guilt, and the need for redemption. Here's how the psychological system worked. Jesus established himself as the ultimate moral authority who had the right to judge and condemn everyone. Then, instead of exercising that right, he voluntarily accepted punishment on their behalf. This created an infinite psychological debt that could never be repaid, ensuring permanent emotional loyalty. The brilliance of this strategy is that it reframed power entirely. Traditional power says, "I'm strong enough to hurt you, so you should obey me." Jesus' power said, "I'm strong enough to be hurt for you, so you should love me." The second approach creates far deeper psychological bonds because it triggers nurturing and protective instincts rather than fear and submission. But Jesus took this even further by claiming that his death wasn't just voluntary. It was necessary for his followers' psychological and spiritual well-being. He convinced them that they were fundamentally broken and needed his sacrifice to be made whole. This created what psychologists call learned helplessness, the belief that they couldn't solve their most important problems without him. The psychological trap was perfect. If people accepted his premise that they needed salvation, then his death became the most valuable gift imaginable. If they rejected that premise, they had to explain why someone would voluntarily die for people who didn't need saving, which made them seem ungrateful and callous. Jesus reinforced this psychology through symbolic rituals. The communion ceremony made his followers regularly reenact consuming his body and blood, literally incorporating his sacrifice into their bodies. This created what anthropologists call ritual bonding, where shared symbolic actions create deep group identity and mutual obligation. Even more sophisticated was how he handled the timing of revealing this strategy. He didn't start with, "I'm going to die for you." He built relationships first, established trust and emotional connection, created feelings of debt and gratitude for his teaching and miracles. Only after people were already psychologically invested did he introduce the concept of ultimate sacrifice. This technique transformed his followers' entire worldview. They couldn't see his death as defeat because he had pre-framed it as victory. They couldn't abandon him after death because that would mean rejecting the greatest gift anyone had ever given them. They couldn't move on to other teachers because no one else had demonstrated love at that level. The psychological result was followers who felt simultaneously completely forgiven and completely obligated. Their guilt for his death created permanent motivation to honor his sacrifice through total commitment. Their gratitude for his love created permanent emotional attachment that transcended rational analysis. This wasn't just effective leadership psychology, this was psychological warfare against every competing worldview, philosophy, or religion. By making his death the ultimate proof of love, Jesus made it impossible for his followers to find equivalent meaning in any other system. Think of Jesus' sacrifice strategy like the ultimate psychological loan with infinite interest that can never be repaid. When someone saves your life, you feel obligated to them forever. But Jesus claimed to save not just your physical life, but your eternal soul at the cost of his own life. This creates what psychologists call survivor's guilt, combined with infinite gratitude. Survivor's guilt makes you feel responsible for someone else's sacrifice on your behalf. Infinite gratitude makes you feel permanently indebted for a gift you could never afford to repay or refuse. The psychological power comes from the impossibility of reciprocation. If someone lends you money, you can pay it back and end the obligation. If someone saves your life, you can save theirs and balance the scales. But if someone dies to give you eternal life, there's literally nothing you can do to repay that debt. You can only honor it through permanent loyalty and service. Jesus made this even more psychologically compelling by claiming his sacrifice was motivated purely by love, not by obligation or expectation of reward. This positioned his followers not as debtors in a business transaction, but as beloved beneficiaries of the ultimate gift. You can walk away from a creditor, but walking away from someone who died because they loved you makes you a monster. The final psychological trap was making his sacrifice both historical and personal. It wasn't just that someone died 2,000 years ago for humanity in general. It was that Jesus personally chose to die specifically because he loved each individual follower enough to endure torture and execution for their benefit. This created what modern psychology calls personalized cosmic significance. The feeling that the most important event in the history of the universe happened specifically for you, personally, because you matter infinitely to the most powerful being in existence. These three psychological techniques, cognitive gap engineering, chosen group illusion, and ultimate sacrifice paradox, created the most powerful persuasion system in human history. Jesus discovered that true influence comes not from forcing people to obey, but from making them desperate to belong. He didn't demand submission. He created addiction to his approval. He didn't threaten punishment. He offered irresistible rewards. 2,000 years later, billions of people remain psychologically captivated by a carpenter who mastered the deepest codes of human consciousness. Whether you see this as divine inspiration or psychological genius, the techniques remain devastatingly effective for anyone who understands how to use them ethically. If these secrets blew your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss history's most powerful secrets. What's your opinion on these ideas? Leave it in the comments. Send this to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on publicly available historical information, not clinical diagnosis. The psychological interpretations presented are for educational purposes and represent parallels with modern psychological research rather than definitive historical facts.